Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be looking at a small problem that War Thunder Top Tier has had for actually a little while now, and trying to break down both its origins and why it is such an issue. So obviously the first question is, what is a dart? A dart is an armor-piercing, fin-stabilized, discarding Sabo or APFS-DS round. The dart, or its origins, actually date back to around World War II era, where you have the armor-piercing composite rigid. These had a much harder internal core and a much softer outer section. This made the round much lighter, and thus you could accelerate it to a much higher velocity, giving it more penetration and flatter trajectories, so they were easier to aim. However, this doesn't really work out so well, so this is where you get these Sabo rounds, where you put a shoe on the round that actually leaves the round itself once it exits the barrel. This is an APDS, or armor-piercing discarding Sabo. However, with the rifling at the time, these had some relative instabilities, so what they did was they added fins, and this is where you get the armor-piercing fin-stabilized discarding Sabo. These are often referred to as darts in War Thunder, and the reason why this is important is once you start to get into modern tanks, the APFS-DS round, the dart, is basically the only round they have for dealing with heavily armored opponents. So if the darts don't work at top tier, or they don't work consistently, you don't have a good alternative to fall back on. Now, in the game of War Thunder, darts are characterized by having a very high muzzle velocity, and they also generally have high penetration. They also have damage that is at least somewhat consistent in most battle ratings. Essentially, how the damage on the dart works is, as long as it goes through at least a certain amount of armor, it will do a very consistent and high shrapneling pattern. The only limitation is that if it doesn't go through enough armor, the shrapneling will be a lot weaker, and if it goes through a lot of armor, so it's just barely breaking through, it will also do much less damage. Now, when you first encounter the darts at around 8.7, 8.3, depending on what tech tree you're in, you're going to notice the darts basically go through everything and always do fairly consistent damage. It's actually pretty rare to have major problems with them unless you're fighting some of the really light wheeled vehicles. However, by the time you get to top tier, this whole metric starts to change, and you start to realize that darts have a bit of an issue in terms of how they damage vehicles, especially the more modern vehicles with a lot of more modern design features that will interfere with their functioning. Now, a high velocity round that goes through a lot of armor and does create pretty consistent shrapneling patterns and is generally pretty easy to aim even at longer ranges, especially with things like laser rangefinders, might sound very appealing, and it might leave the user wondering, why is there a problem with these rounds? Well, it turns out when you first encounter them at 8.0 to 9.0, it kind of depends on what tech tree you're in. What you're going to notice with the darts is that a lot of the enemies you're fighting only have basic rolled homogeneous armor. They also tend to have fairly straightforward internal layouts that don't have a lot of complex internal compartmentalization or other things of that nature. So when you first encounter them, they actually are fantastic, and for a while they remain fantastic. They're a very viable shell that doesn't really have any major issues outside of some of the very lightly armored wheeled vehicles that you'll run into. However, as you start going higher and higher in battle rating, what you'll start to notice pretty quickly is that enemies pick up composite armor, they pick up explosive reactive armor, they pick up spaced armor, and a lot of enemies have combinations of these armor types. It's not simply one or the other. This also combines with some inconsistencies the game has always had when dealing with things like fenders or road wheels, where they kind of seem to get way more armor for the vehicle than they really should. And you also start getting a lot of internal compartmentalization, you start getting spall liners, internal bulkheads, and of course, tanks start using fuel tanks as additive armor a lot more. This is because in the real world, these are effective against darts, and while they should to an extent be effective in game, it doesn't exactly create the most engaging gameplay experience to fire a shell and have it not do damage. Now, problems with darts doing damage isn't exactly a new phenomenon in War Thunder. When the M1 Abrams was first added to the game, its main competition was the T-64, and it turned out compared to the T-64 simply bubble wrapping its crew in ammo, the Abrams having the protected ammo in the back of the turret was a pretty big advantage. It was basically impossible to ammo rack it at all at the time, and also the crew was reasonably difficult to take out in a single shot. This gave the Abrams a pretty noticeable leg up over the T-64s to the point where it actually had to be nerfed because it was a little overpowered. As we start moving forward, we start seeing more and more a trend of top tier of the best tank not necessarily being the one with the best gun, the best mobility, or the best armor, but instead you actually get the vehicle that has the damage model that is the hardest to consistently do damage to, because it turns out if you shoot your opponent perfectly and nothing happens, well, there's not really much you can do about that. You're kind of just hosed. This of course leads us into the current era of War Thunder, with the T-80 BVM being the contender for the tank that takes damage in the most unusual fashion, but I feel like people have really underestimated how much the new Leopard 2s with Spallliners can basically pull a similar trick, but with better in general characteristics, which has allowed them to overtake the PVM to a large extent as the best top tier tanks. However, I feel like it's a little awkward to have tanks that are the best simply be the ones that are the most annoying to kill, not because you can't find a place to pen them, but because you don't really know where to shoot them to actually consistently do damage. In the case of the T-80 BVM, you can often hit the driver's port and only knock out the driver. Leopard 2s, you can shoot a round straight into the gunner, but not hit the commander directly behind him. You can also put a round through the fuel tank and basically do no damage. So you're stuck in a bit of a lottery or a dice roll scenario, and given how fast the reloads are, how fast vehicles can react, and also in general how lethal the shells are, the fact that no tank is basically immune, this is not really a satisfying gameplay experience, as every fight feels like it's a bit of a dice roll. The good news, I would say, for the whole dart problem is that Gaijin do appear to be looking into it and do appear to be acknowledging it's a problem. If you were to look at the 2024 roadmap, you would notice they have features like adding additional effects to vehicles getting penetrated, and also adding additional effects such as internal fires, which likely alludes to how much fuel tanks can eat shrapneling for shells. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of these two changes, as they seem like they would heavily benefit tanks that have good armor, and also unnecessarily punish tanks like the Ariete that basically have no armor at all, and would also be a bit of a problem for tanks like the Merkavas and Abrams that don't have great armor and kind of rely more on their internal build to save them rather than the armor itself. Whereas if you have things like the Leopard and the T-80 BVM, where you have to carefully aim for weak spots to even get a shell into the crew compartment in the first place, they would probably end up coming out a bit on top on that, especially as they can just click on the middle of most common enemies. It is at least a positive sign that Gaijin are acknowledging that a problem exists and looking at potential fixes. Personally, I would rather see an increase to the minimum damage that a shell can produce when it's going through relatively low or relatively high amounts of armor, because I think that's what's creating the biggest problems. Obviously, on autocannons, this kind of a change would be pretty dopey. I think this should only affect shells up to 75mm or higher. But I do think a change to minimum damage dealt would probably be a better solution, as it would increase consistency without relying on adding new mechanics that might just excessively punish tanks that already weren't doing that well in the meta. This is also one of those areas where I feel like going to town on a very intricate damage model is paradoxically making the game a little less authentic than it would be otherwise, as it's creating a lot of inconsistencies with an engine that isn't really designed to handle it, but that's kind of another topic for another time. Anyway, I'm Rabid. I hope you enjoyed the video, hope you learned something. If you agree with me, feel free to post in the comments down below. If you don't agree with me and you think that darts are fine as is and don't really need any adjustments, you can also leave that in the comments down below. I'm actually interested to hear what people's takes are on this topic. Anyway, that's been everything for today. As always, don't forget to shoes.